A shadow appears on the radar screen. Not a ship, not a plane. Something gliding just beneath the surface. Silent, impossible to classify. March 1944, Philippine Sea. Japanese destroyer crews stare at screens showing contacts that vanish before depth charges can be deployed. This is the story of how American submarines became invisible hunters in the Pacific's final year and changed naval warfare forever. The Invisible Edge, U.S. Submarines in 1944, March 15, 1944, 340 hours. Lieutenant Commander Robert Walsh pressed his face against the periscope housing of USS Harder, feeling the cold steel against his cheekbone. His breath came shallow. They'd been submerged for 16 hours, longer than any patrol he'd commanded in 3 years of Pacific operations. The battery indicator showed 18%. In the old boats, they would have surfaced 6 hours ago, would have exposed themselves to Japanese patrol aircraft, gambling on darkness and luck. Walsh had lost 2 friends that way, boats that never came back, their last radio transmissions cut short mid-word. But Harder wasn't an old boat anymore. "Snorkel depth," he said quietly. The diving officer, Lieutenant James Chen, nodded without looking up from his instruments. "Snorkel depth, aye, 18 meters." The boat tilted subtly. Walsh felt it in his knees, that particular angle that meant they were rising toward the thermocline, toward the dangerous zone where periscopes could be spotted, where aircraft ruled the sky. His hands tightened on the periscope handles. "Snorkel extended," Chen reported. His voice carried no emotion, but Walsh saw his jaw muscles working. They'd practiced this modification for 2 weeks in Pearl Harbor, running drills until every man could operate the new equipment blind. But this was the first time they'd used it in enemy waters. The diesel engines coughed once, twice, then caught with a low rumble that traveled through the hull. Walsh waited for the avalanche of sound he'd always associated with running on diesel, the roar that made conversation impossible, the vibration that announced your presence to every destroyer within 10 miles. It didn't come. The engines ran. He could hear them, certainly, feel them through the deck plates. But the sound was muffled, dampened, wrapped in something that absorbed the frequencies that usually screamed "submarine here" to every hydrophone operator in the Western Pacific. "Engine noise?" Walsh asked. Chen checked his instruments. 72 decibels at the hull. Ambient ocean noise is 68. 4 decibels. The difference between being hunted and being invisible. Walsh thought about the German U-boats, how they'd pioneered snorkels in the Atlantic, how Allied destroyers had learned to hunt them anyway. The Kriegsmarine boats could run submerged, yes, but they sounded like freight trains doing it. Hydrophone operators called them singing submarines. The American modification changed everything. "How long can we hold this?" Walsh asked. "Battery recharge estimates 4 hours to 80%, Chen said. "We can run indefinitely as long as sea state stays below force 4. Indefinitely. Walsh let the word settle. In submarine warfare, indefinitely meant survival. It meant you chose when to surface, not when your batteries forced you to. It meant you hunted instead of hiding. He rotated the periscope slowly, scanning the horizon. Dawn was maybe 90 minutes away, the most dangerous time, when Japanese patrol planes launched from Truk and Palau to sweep the convoy routes. In the old boats, they would have been diving deep by now, conserving battery, hoping the destroyers above them would move on. "Sonar contact," the sound operator called out. "Bearing 270, single screw, probably a patrol boat." Walsh swung the periscope. There, a dark shape against the lighter sky, maybe 8,000 yards out. Moving slowly, zigzagging, searching. "They're hunting something," he said. "Probably the convoy we hit yesterday," Chen replied. "We sank 2 transports. They know someone's out here." Walsh watched the patrol boat. It was close enough that in the old boats he would have gone deep, rigged for silent running, spent 6 hours barely breathing while destroyers pinged away overhead. He'd done that dance a dozen times, that helpless waiting while depth charges walked closer, while you counted seconds between explosions and prayed the math worked in your favor. Maintain snorkel depth, he said. Maintain present course. Chen looked at him. It wasn't quite insubordination, just that flicker of concern that said, "We're supposed to dive." "We're quieter than the ocean," Walsh said. "Let's see if it's true." The patrol boat came closer, 5,000 yards, 3,000. Walsh could see details now through the periscope, the mounted gun on the foredeck, the depth charge racks on the stern. Men moving on deck, someone pointing. Had they seen the periscope? The snorkel intake was designed to look like driftwood from a distance, but at this range... "They're turning away," the sonar operator said, bearing changing to 285. Walsh watched the patrol boat continue its search pattern, moving off to the northwest. It passed within 1,500 yards of Harder's position, close enough that in any previous war, in any previous technology, they would have been detected, close enough that Walsh could count the depth charges in their racks. The Japanese never slowed down. "They didn't hear us," Chen said. His voice carried something Walsh rarely heard from his diving officer: wonder. "They didn't hear us," Walsh confirmed. 3 months earlier, Walsh had sat in a briefing room in Pearl Harbor, watching a commander from ships, the Bureau of Ships, explain the modification with the enthusiasm of someone describing a new kind of can opener. "The Germans use a simple valve system," the commander said, pointing to schematics spread across the table. "Air intake, diesel exhaust, mechanical ball valve to prevent water ingress. Functional, but crude." Walsh had studied the drawings. He'd read the intelligence reports from the Atlantic, how German snorkels let U-boats stay submerged longer, but how they still got caught because their engines sounded like industrial machinery running underwater. "What makes ours different?" he'd asked. The commander smiled. "Two things. First, we've wrapped the entire snorkel tube assembly in acoustic dampening material, specialized rubber compounds that absorb sound frequencies between 50 and 5,000 hertz. That's the range where diesel engines are loudest." He pulled out another schematic. "Second, we've redesigned the engine mounts themselves. Instead of bolting directly to the hull, they're suspended on isolators that prevent vibration transfer. The sound doesn't reach the water." "What's the reduction?" Walsh had asked. "In testing, we've achieved approximately 90% noise suppression compared to standard surface operation. From a hydrophone perspective, you're quieter than a school of tuna." Walsh had looked at the other submarine commanders in the briefing room. All of them had the same expression: cautious hope mixed with skepticism. They'd been promised miracle weapons before: torpedoes that ran straight, radar that could spot periscopes, deck guns that wouldn't jam. "How many boats are getting this?" someone asked. "Initial rollout is 20 submarines in the Pacific Fleet," the commander said. "If results are positive, we'll retrofit the entire force by summer." Results. Walsh understood what that meant. It meant they were the test case. It meant if something went wrong, they'd learn from the wreckage. If this works, he'd thought, studying the schematics, we stop being prey. April 8, 1944. Harder had been on patrol for 3 weeks. They'd sunk 4 Japanese transports, a destroyer, and something that might have been a submarine tender. The identification had been uncertain in the darkness, but the secondary explosion suggested ammunition or fuel storage. Walsh kept a private log, separate from the official patrol report. In it, he documented every hour they'd spent at snorkel depth, every time Japanese ASW forces had passed nearby without detecting them, every tactical advantage the modification provided. The numbers told a story: 487 hours submerged, previous patrol average 312 hours, 23 enemy contacts while at snorkel depth detected by enemy, 0, battery efficiency increased by 34%, no emergency surfaces to recharge, tactical repositioning in daylight, 8 times, previously impossible. But numbers couldn't capture what it felt like to hunt instead of hide, to watch destroyers search for you while you recharged batteries 20 meters below them, to know that the most powerful ASW forces in the Japanese Navy couldn't hear you even when you were running full diesel power. It's like being a ghost, Chen said one evening when they were plotting the next day's patrol route. Walsh nodded. The Japanese know we're here. They've seen the torpedo wakes, recovered survivors who described American submarines. But they can't find us. Their doctrine is built around forcing subs to surface, Chen said. Maintain pressure, use aircraft, wait for the batteries to die. What do they do when we don't surface? They've started calling us KAG, Walsh said. The radio intercepts picked it up. It means shadow. Chen considered this. Shadows aren't supposed to kill you. No, Walsh agreed. They're not. If you're starting to understand how technology changes war before tactics adapt to it, hit that like button, because what happened next would prove that innovation without adaptation is just expensive metal. The tactical implications emerged slowly, like developing photographs in a dark room. In May, Walsh attended a coordination meeting with other submarine commanders who'd received the snorkel modification. They gathered in a hotel conference room in Midway, sharing coffee and operational data, while maintenance crews serviced their boats. Commander Frank Morrison from USS Dace spread photographs on the table, aerial reconnaissance shots of the Luzon Strait. We stayed submerged for 42 hours straight, Morrison said. Maintained 6 knots the entire time. Crossed the strait in daylight, recharged batteries while Japanese patrol planes flew overhead. He tapped one photograph. This convoy passed within 3 miles. We let them go because we were on a reconnaissance mission, but we could have hit them. They never knew we were there. Lieutenant Commander Sam Dealey from USS Harder, no relation to Walsh's boat, just unfortunate naming coincidence, leaned forward. What's the longest anyone stayed down? 71 hours, said a voice from the back. Commander Hiram Cassidy from USS Tilefish. Weather was rough, force 5 Cs, so we had to go deeper than optimal snorkel depth. But we maintained diesel operation at 30 meters by extending the snorkel and accepting some water ingress. Managed it with the ballast pumps. 71 hours. 3 full days submerged. Walsh tried to imagine his crew's mental state after that long underwater. Even with the snorkel providing fresh air, even with the knowledge that they could surface any time, there was something psychologically taxing about being separated from the sky for that long. What about maintenance? Someone asked. Engine hours at that duration. Surprisingly minimal, Cassidy said. The noise-dampening material also provides thermal insulation. Engine temperatures stay more consistent. We're actually seeing less wear than conventional surface operations. Morrison pulled out a chart. I've been tracking Japanese ASW patterns. Before the snorkel modifications, their doctrine made sense. Establish a perimeter, use aircraft to maintain pressure, force the submarine to surface or relocate. Statistically, it worked. We lost boats. He drew circles on the chart. Now they're still using the same doctrine, but we're not following the script. We're staying in their patrol zones, operating during daylight, attacking, and then remaining in the same area. They don't know how to respond. They're increasing destroyer patrols, Dealey said. I counted 14 in my sector last week. They're throwing resources at a problem they can't solve with more resources. Because their hydrophone technology hasn't changed, Walsh said. They're listening for submarines that sound like we used to sound. When their operators hear something, it's actual whales and fish schools. We're below their detection threshold. A captain from SubPac, Submarine Pacific Fleet, stood up. Walsh hadn't noticed him sitting in the corner, observing. Gentlemen, the captain said, what you're describing is a paradigm shift. The Japanese built their ASW doctrine around the assumption that submarines are loud, slow, and battery limited. That assumption is now false, but they don't know it yet. He walked to the table, studied Morrison's charts. The question is, how do we exploit this before they adapt? The room went quiet. Exploitation meant changing tactics, taking risks, pushing the technology to its limits. It meant trusting that the rubber-wrapped tubes and isolated engine mounts would keep working when you were surrounded by destroyers. Wolfpack tactics, Walsh said. That's what the Germans used in the Atlantic. Multiple boats coordinating overwhelming convoy defenses. The Atlantic is different, Morrison countered. Longer range, more predictable convoy routes. In the Pacific, we're dealing with island hopping, irregular schedules, weather patterns that... The principle is the same, Walsh interrupted. We can communicate, we can coordinate, and now we can stay in position indefinitely. 3 submarines spread across a 20-mile front, all at snorkel depth, all invisible. He drew lines on Morrison's chart. Any convoy that comes through, we hit them from multiple angles. They can't defend against threats they can't locate. The subpack captain nodded slowly. It's worth testing. Commander Walsh, Commander Morrison, Commander Dealey, I want you to coordinate a joint patrol, Luzon Strait. Japanese are running supplies to their garrisons in the Philippines. Heavy destroyer escorts, air cover. If the snorkel modification works as advertised, you should be able to penetrate their defenses. And if it doesn't, Morrison asked. Then we'll learn from the mistake, the captain said. But I don't think it will fail. The technology is sound. The question is whether you gentlemen have the nerve to use it the way it's meant to be used. June 19th, 1944, 0200 hours. Walsh studied the chart in Harder's control room. 3 submarines, Harder's, Dace, and the other, Harder, formed a patrol line across the Luzon Strait, 30 miles of ocean, covered by 3 boats that the Japanese Navy couldn't detect. Morrison reports contact, the radio operator said. Convoy bearing 290, speed 12 knots, heavy escorts. Walsh plotted the position. The convoy would enter their patrol zone in approximately 4 hours, right around dawn. Classic Japanese timing, transit through potentially dangerous waters during daylight, rely on air cover and destroyer screens. Send to all boats, Walsh said. Maintain position. Hold fire until convoy enters kill zone. They went to snorkel depth at 0530, just as the first light touched the eastern horizon. The diesel engines hummed their muffled song. Through the periscope, Walsh could see Japanese patrol planes, Nakajima E-8N float planes, flying low search patterns. The planes passed overhead twice. Walsh never moved the periscope. The snorkel intake, designed to break up the water's surface with minimal visual signature, looked like debris. The periscope itself was barely exposed, just enough for observation. At 06-117, the convoy appeared. Walsh counted ships through the periscope. 4 large transports, probably carrying troops and equipment for the Philippine garrisons. 2 destroyers in front, 2 on the flanks, 1 trailing. Standard protective formation. The destroyers would be pinging actively with sonar, their hydrophone operators listening for the telltale sounds of submarine propellers and diesel engines. They would hear nothing. Range to lead transport? Walsh asked. 8,000 yards, Chen replied. Solution ready on tubes 1 through 4. Hold fire, Walsh said. Wait for Morrison and Dealey to report ready. This was the test. 3 submarines attacking simultaneously, exploiting the Japanese inability to locate them. If it worked, it would change how America fought the Pacific War. If it failed, if even one of them was detected, the destroyers would swarm, and it would become a running battle. Dace reports ready, the radio operator said. Target second transport. Harder, the other one, reports ready. Target third transport. Walsh allowed himself a thin smile. Each submarine had chosen a different target. Coordinated, efficient, maximizing damage. This was how you sank an entire convoy. Stand by all tubes, he said. The convoy came closer, 6,000 yards, 5,000. The destroyers maintained their positions, unaware that 3 submarines were tracking them, had been tracking them for the past 30 minutes. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. The torpedoes left their tubes with muffled thumps. Walsh counted seconds. At this range, with the Mark 18 electric torpedoes, they had approximately 3 minutes until impact. Through the periscope, he saw the lead transport continue forward, oblivious. The destroyers maintained their pattern. Nobody was reacting. Torpedoes running true, Chen reported. Walsh waited. 180 seconds, it felt like hours. The first torpedo hit the transport below the waterline, amidships. The explosion was massive, a column of water and debris that rose 50 feet. Before the sound even reached Harder, the second torpedo struck, then the third. The transport broke apart. Simultaneously, Walsh saw explosions on the second and third transports. Morrison and Dealey had fired within seconds of him. The coordinated attack was working exactly as planned. Destroyers are reacting, the sonar operator said. Multiple contacts increasing speed, changing course. Walsh watched through the periscope. The destroyers were moving, certainly, but moving to help the sinking transports, not to attack submarines. They didn't know where the threat was. To them, the torpedoes had come from nowhere. The fourth transport is turning away, Chen observed, making maximum speed. Let them go, Walsh said. We've proven the concept. But Morrison had other ideas. Through the periscope, Walsh saw more torpedoes hit the fourth transport. Dace had repositioned and fired again. The transport shuddered, listed heavily to port. Destroyer is pinging, the sonar operator reported. Active sonar bearing 180. They're searching. Walsh lowered the periscope. Maintain snorkel depth. Maintain present course. It felt insane, staying at snorkel depth while a destroyer actively searched for you. Every instinct screamed to go deep, to hide, to put as much water as possible between Harder and the hunters above. But the numbers said they were safe. The noise profile said they were invisible. The technology said, "Destroyer passing overhead," the sonar operator said. His voice was tight. "Range 400 yards. Still pinging." Walsh felt the tension in the control room. Every man aware that death was sailing directly above them, that only the rubber-wrapped tubes and isolated engine mounts stood between them and depth charges. The destroyer's screws sounded like thunder through the hull, close enough to hear individual propeller blades cutting water, close enough that Walsh could imagine reaching up and touching the keel. The pinging continued. Active sonar. The destroyer was broadcasting sound waves, listening for echoes. But Harder's hull was designed to minimize returns, and the snorkel at 18 meters created a confused acoustic picture. Destroyer bearing 195, the sonar operator said. Moving away, range increasing. They hadn't been detected. Walsh raised the periscope again. The destroyer was continuing its search pattern, moving off to the northeast. Behind it, 3 transports were sinking, 2 completely gone, 1 capsizing slowly. The 4th transport was limping away, barely making headway. Subscribe to this channel to catch the next incredible story that official history forgot, because what happened in the weeks that followed would prove that even invisible weapons create visible consequences. Surface activity, the sonar operator reported. Multiple small contacts, probably survivors in the water. Walsh swept the periscope across the scene. Men in the water clinging to debris. Japanese sailors and soldiers who'd been on their way to defend another island, another airfield, another doomed garrison. He could surface, could rescue them, take prisoners. In the old boats, that would have been impossible. Surfacing in enemy waters with destroyers nearby meant almost certain death. But with the snorkel, with the ability to remain undetected— "Sir?" Chen asked quietly. Walsh lowered the periscope. "We maintain position. Monitor the destroyers. If they depart the area, we surface and take prisoners." It was a calculated risk, but then everything about this new way of fighting was a calculated risk. The question was whether the calculation would hold. The destroyer screen remained in the area for 3 hours. Walsh monitored them through the periscope, watching their search pattern grow increasingly erratic. They were dropping depth charges at random, hoping to get lucky. Some explosions were close enough that Harder's hull rang like a bell, but none were close enough to cause damage. The Japanese didn't know where to aim. At 1100 hours, the destroyers gave up. They'd gathered what survivors they could find. Walsh counted maybe 200 men pulled from the water and departed the area at high speed, probably returning to report the attack. "Surface the boat," Walsh ordered. They came up slowly, cautiously. The sea was empty except for debris, Shattered wood, cargo containers, bodies. Walsh stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon through binoculars. No contacts, the lookout reported. Send divers down, Walsh said. I want to examine that cargo if possible, and check for survivors. The crew went to work. Divers brought up waterlogged documents, equipment, personal effects. One of them surfaced holding a wooden crate with Japanese markings. What is it? Walsh called down. Radio equipment, sir. Looks like command and control gear for an airfield. Walsh nodded. The transports had been carrying supplies for Japanese bases in the Philippines, equipment that would never arrive, defenses that would never be built. Survivors? He asked. None found, sir. Anyone who survived is probably miles away by now. Walsh scanned the debris field one more time. Somewhere in official reports, this would be recorded as a successful attack. 4 transports sunk, total tonnage estimated at 30,000 tons. The numbers would go into spreadsheets, contribute to statistics about Japanese logistics being strangled. But Walsh saw something else, evidence of a new kind of warfare. 3 submarines had operated in coordinated fashion, in enemy-controlled waters, in daylight, under the nose of destroyer escorts and air patrols. They'd attacked simultaneously from multiple positions and then remained in the area for hours without being detected. The Japanese had no doctrine for this, no countermeasure, no way to defend against threats they couldn't locate. Dive the boat, Walsh said. Snorkel depth. Resume patrol. July 1944. The wolf pack tactic spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Submarines with snorkel modifications hunted in groups, coordinated through radio communications, exploited their invisibility to take positions that would have been suicidal months earlier. The results were devastating. Japanese merchant tonnage losses in July 1944 exceeded 300,000 tons, double the monthly average from 1943. More significantly, the losses occurred in areas the Japanese had previously considered safe. Convoys with heavy destroyer escorts were being decimated. Supply lines to garrisons throughout the Pacific were collapsing. Walsh read the intelligence reports during Harder's refit in Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy had begun routing convoys through narrow straits and close to coastlines, trying to minimize exposure to open ocean where submarines could operate freely. But the snorkel modification made this strategy obsolete. American boats could sit in shallow water in the middle of shipping lanes, waiting. They're adapting, Chen said, reading over Walsh's shoulder. Look at this. They're running more night convoys, using weather fronts for cover. It won't help, Walsh said. We can track them with radar, position ourselves ahead of them, wait at snorkel depth. Weather doesn't matter when you're underwater. They must realize what's happening. That our boats have changed somehow. Walsh shrugged. Maybe. But knowing something has changed and being able to counter it are different things. Their hydrophones can't hear us. Their radar can't see a snorkel intake. Their depth charges can't hit what they can't locate. What countermeasure do they develop? Chen didn't answer. There was no good answer. The Japanese were fighting with 1942 technology against 1944 capabilities. The gap wasn't something you closed with tactics or training. I spoke with a commander from the submarine tender, Chen said after a moment. He told me they're retrofitting the entire fleet. Every boat gets the snorkel modification by September. Good, Walsh said. We'll need them. For what? Walsh pointed to a map on the wall, the Western Pacific, the Philippines, the Japanese home islands beyond. The war's not over. The Japanese have 1 million men dug into fortifications from here to Tokyo. Every one of those men needs food, ammunition, equipment. All of it comes by ship. You're talking about a blockade. I'm talking about making it impossible for Japan to continue fighting. We can do that now. We couldn't before. Their ASW forces were too effective. We were losing boats, had to pull back from their coastal waters. But now, Walsh traced lines on the map. We put submarines here, here, and here. Snorkel depth. Invisible. They can't supply their armies. They can't move their fleet. They can't fight a war when every ship that leaves port gets sunk. Chen paused. That's not just tactics. That's strategy. Technology changes strategy, Walsh said. The snorkel modification didn't just make us quieter, it made us able to execute missions that were impossible before. That's the real innovation, not the hardware, but what the hardware enables. August 12, 1944, 2100 hours. Walsh sat in Harder's control room, listening to radio reports from across the Pacific. American submarines were operating with unprecedented freedom, attacking in broad daylight, remaining in enemy waters for weeks at a time, sinking ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The numbers told the story. July 1944, 56. Japanese ships sunk by submarines, 301,000 tons. First 2 weeks of August, 32 ships sunk, 168,000 tons. Submarine losses, 3 boats, compared to 15 in the same period in 1943. But Walsh was reading a different report, an intelligence summary from radio intercepts of Japanese military communications. The Japanese Navy had begun referring to American submarines as Mabaroshi, phantoms. Their doctrine manuals were being rewritten. Destroyer commanders were reporting contacts that disappeared, torpedo attacks from unknown positions, convoys being devastated without ever detecting the attacking submarines. One intercepted message particularly struck Walsh, a Japanese destroyer captain describing an attack on a convoy he'd been escorting. 4 transports sunk within 10 minutes. Active sonar revealed no contacts, no periscopes observed, no torpedo wakes until impact. The enemy is not where our instruments say they should be. They are everywhere and nowhere. How do we fight shadows? How do you fight shadows? Walsh thought about the briefing in Pearl Harbor 8 months ago. The commander from Butte Ships explaining noise dampening and isolated engine mounts. It had seemed like a technical modification, an improvement certainly, but just an incremental advance in submarine design. But incremental advances in the right direction, at the right time, could change wars. The Germans had invented the snorkel, but they'd used it as a defensive measure, a way to stay submerged longer, to hide more effectively from Allied hunters. American engineers had taken the same basic concept and added acoustic suppression, transformed it from a survival tool into a hunting advantage, the difference between hiding and hunting, between prey and predator. "Sir," Chen said, breaking Walsh's reverie, "we're approaching the patrol coordinates." Walsh stood up, walked to the chart table. Their assigned area was the East China Sea, between Japan and the Asian mainland. Before the snorkel modification, operating here would have been near suicidal. Japanese coastal patrols were heavy, air cover was continuous, and the shallow waters made deep diving difficult. Now, Harder would spend 2 weeks here, at snorkel depth, invisible, waiting for targets that wouldn't know they were being hunted until torpedoes were already in the water. "Take us to snorkel depth," Walsh said. "Maintain present course." The boat tilted, the diesels engaged with their familiar muffled rumble. Through the hull, Walsh could hear the ocean, the background sound of waves and current and marine life that would mask their presence completely. Somewhere above them, Japanese patrol planes were searching. Destroyers were running their sonar patterns. Radar stations were scanning the surface. They would find nothing. Just top moment, 35-40% mark, August 15, 1944, 14:30 hours. The convoy appeared exactly where intelligence had predicted. 6 transports, 4 destroyers, heading northeast toward the Japanese home islands. Probably carrying raw materials from occupied territories, Walsh thought. Rubber, oil, minerals, the resources Japan needed to continue the war. Harder had been at snorkel depth for 9 hours, positioned across the convoy's projected route. Morrison's Dace was 12 miles to the north. Another boat, USS Flasher, was covering the southern approach. "This is different from Luzon Strait," Chen said, studying the chart. "These are Japanese home waters. Response time will be faster, more patrol planes, more destroyers nearby." "Doesn't matter if they can't find us," Walsh replied. But even as he said it, Walsh felt the weight of that statement. They'd been operating with this technology for 6 months now. Somewhere, somehow, the Japanese would adapt. They had to. No navy could sustain these losses without developing countermeasures. unless the countermeasure didn't exist yet. Convoy range 6,000 yards, Chen reported. Solution ready. Walsh raised the periscope. The convoy was maintaining tight formation, transports in the center, destroyers forming a protective box around them. Textbook defensive posture. Would have been effective against submarines operating with pre-1944 technology. Fire 1 through 6, Walsh ordered. 6 torpedoes launched in sequence. Walsh watched through the periscope as they tracked toward the convoy. He counted seconds. The first explosion caught the lead transport near the bow. The second hit amidships. Before the convoy could even begin to react, 4 more explosions rippled through the formation. Morrison and Flasher had fired simultaneously. 3 transports were sinking within 2 minutes. The destroyers responded instantly, breaking formation, increasing speed, beginning their search pattern. Walsh watched them through the periscope. They were well trained, professional, executing their doctrine perfectly. It wouldn't help them. Maintaining snorkel depth, Chen said. Destroyers approaching our position. Walsh lowered the periscope slightly, keeping only the minimum exposure. 2 destroyers were coming straight toward Harder, close enough that he could see individual sailors on deck, see the depth charge crews standing ready. Sir, Chen said quietly. There was a question in his voice. Hold position, Walsh said. Every instinct, every training drill, every doctrine manual said to go deep when destroyers approached. But going deep meant running on battery power, meant limited speed, meant you couldn't recharge, meant eventually you'd have to surface. The modification had freed them from that constraint. But freedom required trust that the rubber-wrapped tubes would keep working, that the isolated engine mounts would prevent vibration transfer, that the mathematics of acoustic suppression would hold when destroyers were close enough to hit with a thrown rock. The first destroyer passed 300 yards from Harder's position, close enough that Walsh could count the depth charges in their racks. 22, each one carrying 300 pounds of Torpex explosive. The destroyer's sonar was pinging continuously. The sound traveled through Harder's hull like hammering on metal. Active sonar, broadcasting, listening for returns. Walsh watched the destroyer's wake through the periscope. It continued past, still searching, unaware that its target was directly below. Second destroyer bearing 120, the sonar operator reported. Range 800 yards. This one was moving slower, zigzagging, clearly searching. Its sonar pattern was different. Longer pulses, different frequency. They were trying different detection methods. Sir, Chen said again. His voice was steady, but Walsh heard the tension underneath. Recommend going to deep depth. Maintain snorkel depth, Walsh replied. The second destroyer came closer, 500 yards, 300. Walsh could see crew members pointing toward Harder's position. Had they seen the snorkel intake? The periscope? The destroyer turned sharply, increased speed, was coming directly toward them. They've detected something, Chen said. Probably the snorkel wake. Walsh's hand tightened on the periscope housing. This was the moment. Either the technology worked and they survived, or it didn't, and they died. There was no middle ground. Stand by for depth charges, he said calmly. The destroyer came closer, 100 yards, 50. Close enough that Walsh could see the depth charge crew leaning over the stern, ready to drop their cargo. The destroyer passed over Harder's position. No depth charges fell. Walsh watched through the periscope as the destroyer continued past, maintaining its course. After another 200 yards, it slowed, began dropping depth charges at random, hoping to get lucky. The explosions were close enough to feel, but not close enough to damage. The Japanese were guessing, firing blind. They passed directly over us, Chen said. His voice carried disbelief. They saw something, Walsh said. The snorkel wake, maybe the periscope. But they couldn't classify it. To them, we looked like debris, a floating log. Anything except what we actually are. He lowered the periscope completely. The control room was silent except for the muffled rumble of the diesel engines and the distant percussion of depth charges exploding in the wrong place. That's what the intelligence reports mean, Walsh continued. When they say the Japanese see us as gliding shadows, they detect something, a radar return, a visual contact, a disturbance in the water, but it doesn't match their classification system for submarines, so they dismiss it, or they guess wrong, or they waste depth charges on empty ocean. Chen stared at the depth gauge. We're hunting in their home waters, at snorkel depth, while they're searching for us. And they can't find us, even when they're looking directly at us. It was a choice, Walsh said quietly. The engineers could have made a snorkel that just let us stay submerged longer, defensive. But they chose to make us invisible instead, offensive. That choice changed everything. The convoy attack marked a turning point, not because of the ships sunk, though 3 transports represented significant tonnage, but because of where it happened. The East China Sea was Japan's backyard. If American submarines could operate there with impunity, could remain undetected even when enemy forces were actively searching, then no Japanese waters were safe. The implications rippled through both navies. August 1944, Japanese Naval Command, Tokyo. The intercepted communications painted a picture of increasing desperation. Japanese naval staff were analyzing attack patterns, trying to understand how American submarines had become so effective. Their reports focused on numbers. Submarine contacts detected, down 68% from January 1944. Successful attacks by detected submarines, up 127%. Average time between detection and attack, decreased from 4.2 hours to 12 minutes. Depth charge success rate down from 8.3% to 0.7%. But the numbers couldn't explain the fundamental problem. American submarines had become undetectable. Not harder to detect, actually undetectable. The Japanese were using the same hydrophones, the same sonar, the same search procedures that had worked in 1942 and 1943. The technology hadn't degraded. The targets had evolved. One report, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, summarized the dilemma. Enemy submarines appear to have achieved operational parameters inconsistent with known capabilities. Recommend immediate investigation of potential technological breakthrough. But investigation required time the Japanese didn't have. September 3, 1944, Pearl Harbor. Walsh attended another conference, this time with representatives from Naval Intelligence and the War Department. The atmosphere was different from the May meeting, less experimental, more strategic. The snorkel modification had proven itself. Now the question was how to exploit it fully. A rear admiral from Sank, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, addressed the assembled submarine commanders. Gentlemen, in the past 6 months, submarines equipped with snorkel modifications have sunk 437 Japanese vessels, totaling 2.1 million tons. For comparison, all submarines combined sank 1.8 million tons in the entire year of 1943. He let that sink in. The Japanese merchant fleet is being destroyed faster than they can replace it. But more importantly, we're achieving these results with 65% fewer submarine losses. The technology isn't just making you more effective, it's keeping you alive. Morrison raised his hand. Sir, what's the strategic objective? Are we looking at a blockade? We're looking at strangulation, the admiral replied. Japan is an island nation that imports 90% of its petroleum, 70% of its iron ore, 60% of its food for industrial workers. All of it comes by ship. With conventional submarine operations, we could harass their shipping. With the snorkel modification, we can stop it completely. He pointed to a map of the Western Pacific. By October, every submarine in the Pacific Fleet will be equipped with snorkel capability. We're positioning boats here, here, and here. He indicated points around Japan. Between the home islands and the Asian mainland. Between the home islands and the southern resource area. Between major ports. Creating a network where nothing moves without being detected and attacked. What about their response? Walsh asked. They must be developing countermeasures. They are, the admiral confirmed. Intelligence reports indicate they're experimenting with new hydrophone designs, different sonar frequencies, even attempting to develop their own quiet submarine technology. But development takes time. By the time they have working countermeasures, the war will be decided. It was a brutal calculus. The Japanese were drowning, and by the time they learned to swim, they'd already be underwater. September 1944, October 1944. Harder spent 8 consecutive weeks on patrol in the East China Sea and Yellow Sea. They sank 14 ships, transports, tankers, a cruiser that had the misfortune to cross their path at dawn. They operated at snorkel depth for 87% of the patrol, surfaced only for maintenance and to transfer wounded crew to a submarine tender. Walsh kept his private log updated with observations that went beyond official reports. Sept 15 passed within 400 yards of Japanese coastal patrol. They were searching for us. We'd attacked a convoy 6 hours earlier. We remained at snorkel depth, engines running, recharging batteries. They never slowed. The psychological impact on enemy forces must be significant. They're hunting an enemy they cannot find. Sept 29. Encountered 3 destroyers conducting ASW sweep. Textbook pattern properly executed. We positioned ourselves in the center of their search area and waited. They spent 4 hours searching, dropped 37 depth charges, none closer than 600 yards. We fired on them as they departed, sank one, damaged another. The survivors must be wondering what they're fighting. Oct. 8. Chen observed that crew morale has changed. Before snorkel modification, patrol meant constant tension. Surface to charge batteries, dive when aircraft appear, surface again, repeat. Now we control our exposure. Men sleep better. Equipment runs smoother. It's remarkable how much fear takes out of a fighting force, and how much capability returns when that fear is removed. But the most significant entry came on October 12th. Intercepted Japanese radio transmission in plain language. Unusual, suggests desperation. Translated excerpt, all vessels advised. American submarines employing new detection evasion technology. Standard ASW procedures ineffective. Recommend independent routing. Random schedule changes. Maintain maximum speed in transit zones. Convoy system compromised. Walsh read that transmission 3 times. The Japanese were abandoning the convoy system. It was an admission of defeat, acknowledgement that they couldn't protect their shipping, that the war at sea was lost. Without convoys, every ship traveled alone, unprotected, vulnerable. The submarines would feast. October 23, 1944. Philippine Sea. Harder was tracking a lone tanker, probably carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. The tanker was zigzagging erratically, making 16 knots, running without any escort. They're gambling, Chen said. Speed and random course changes instead of destroyer protection. Walsh nodded. Probably don't have destroyers to spare, and they know the destroyers can't protect them anyway. He watched the tanker through the periscope. It was a large vessel, maybe 12,000 tons. Fully loaded based on how low it sat in the water. Thousands of barrels of oil that Japanese factories needed, that Japanese aircraft required, that Japanese armies were starving for. Solution ready, Chen reported. Walsh hesitated. It wasn't uncertainty about the attack. The tanker was a legitimate target, carrying war materials to an enemy nation. But something about this moment felt different, significant. Fire 1 and 2, he said. 2 torpedoes. The tanker had no chance to evade. Both hit within seconds of each other, and the ship exploded in a massive fireball, oil burning on the water, spreading in all directions. Walsh watched through the periscope as the tanker sank. No survivors visible. The crew would have been incinerated in the initial explosion. Add it to the log, he said quietly. But what he was thinking, what he couldn't put in any official report, was that this was what strategic victory looked like, not grand battles between fleets, not dramatic dogfights or heroic last stands, just a tanker burning in an empty sea, oil that would never reach Japan, factories that would slow, aircraft that wouldn't fly, armies that couldn't move, war reduced to mathematics, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, supply consumed versus supply delivered, and the equation was tilting irreversibly towards zero. The Japanese couldn't win a war of mathematics, not against American industrial capacity, not against a submarine force that had become effectively invisible. Set course for the next patrol sector, Walsh said. Harder submerged to snorkel depth and vanished into the Philippine Sea. November 1944. The pattern continued across the Pacific. American submarines, now fully equipped with snorkel modifications, hunted with impunity. Japanese shipping losses exceeded 500,000 tons per month. Ports were crowded with ships afraid to leave harbor. Factories were shutting down for lack of raw materials. Walsh received intelligence summaries during Harder's brief refit in Guam. The numbers told the story. Japanese oil imports, down 72% from January 1944. Iron ore imports, down 64%. Food imports, down 58%. Merchant fleet capacity, reduced by 43% since January. But more telling were the qualitative reports. Japanese Army units in the Philippines and Indonesia were reporting fuel shortages. Aircraft were being grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Ships were being loaded but not departing because the risk of submarine attack was considered too high. "They're being strangled," Morrison said. He'd come aboard Harder for a planning session. The two boats were coordinating patrols around Taiwan. Not quickly, not dramatically, but methodically. "The war in the Pacific isn't being won on beaches," Walsh said. "It's being won here, in the water, by boats the enemy can't see." Morrison studied the intelligence reports. "Do you think they'll surrender when they can't move supplies, can't fuel their fleet, can't feed their armies?" Walsh shook his head. "I think they'll fight until they physically can't anymore. But that endpoint is closer than it would have been. The snorkel modification didn't just make us better at our jobs, it accelerated the timeline of the entire war." December 15, 1944. Zhou 600 hours. Walsh stood on Harder's Bridge, watching the sunrise over the Pacific. They were completing their 11th war patrol, the longest continuous deployment of any submarine in the fleet. 11 patrols, 43 ships sunk, 0 damage sustained. Chen climbed up from below. "Morning, sir." "Morning, James." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the light spread across the water. "I was thinking about that briefing," Chen said, "back in March, when they told us about the modification." "What about it?" "The commander said we'd achieve 90% noise suppression. Made it sound like an engineering specification. Numbers on a chart." "It was," Walsh said. "But it wasn't just numbers," Chen continued. "It was the difference between being prey and being predator, between hiding and hunting, between losing boats every month and coming home safely. The difference between a war that might have lasted until 1947 and one that might end in 1945. Walsh nodded slowly. "Technology changes wars, not always, obviously. Sometimes it's just a rubber-wrapped tube and some isolated engine mounts. But those small changes ripple outward. The Japanese never had a chance," Chen said. "Not once we had this advantage." "They had a chance before," Walsh corrected. "In 1942, 1943, they were winning the submarine war, sinking our boats faster than we could deploy them. But then the advantage shifted, not because they got worse, because we got better." He turned to Chen. "That's the lesson, I think. Technology is never static. The moment you stop innovating, you start losing. The Japanese built a doctrine around 1942 capabilities, ours and theirs. We changed the capabilities. Their doctrine became obsolete. By the time they realized it, the war was already decided." January 15, 1945, Pearl Harbor. Walsh submitted Harder's final patrol report and attended his last formal briefing. The war was entering its endgame. American forces were advancing through the Philippines. Plans were being drawn up for an invasion of Okinawa, then Japan itself. The admiral who'd addressed them in September stood before the assembled submarine commanders again. "Gentlemen, I wanted to give you perspective on what you've accomplished. In the 12 months since the snorkel modification was introduced, American submarines have sunk 1,247 Japanese vessels, nearly 4 million tons. Japanese merchant capacity has been reduced by 67%. Their naval fuel reserves are at 11% of what they were in January 1944. They literally cannot operate their fleet. He paused. But more significantly, you've done this while losing only 9 submarines, compared to 31 lost in 1943. The technology didn't just make you more effective, it kept you alive to continue fighting. Walsh looked around the room. These were men who'd spent months at sea, hunting in waters that should have been death traps. Men who'd trusted that rubber-wrapped tubes and isolated engine mounts would keep them invisible when destroyers passed overhead. The technology had held, every single time. The war isn't over, the admiral continued, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Japan cannot continue fighting without supplies, and they cannot move supplies without ships, and they cannot protect ships from submarines they cannot detect. He looked directly at the assembled commanders. You've achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. You've made an entire enemy fleet operationally irrelevant, not by sinking it in battle, though you've done plenty of that, but by making it impossible for that fleet to accomplish its mission. February 1945. Walsh received orders for a new assignment, training duty, teaching the next generation of submarine commanders how to utilize snorkel tactics effectively. Harder would continue her patrols under a new commander. The last time Walsh stood on her bridge was during a training exercise off Hawaii. They were demonstrating snorkel operations to a group of newly qualified submarine officers. "Take her to snorkel depth," he instructed the new commanding officer. The boat submerged smoothly. The diesels engaged with their muffled rumble. Walsh watched the depth gauge settle at 18 meters, the perfect balance between deep enough to be undetectable and shallow enough to operate the snorkel efficiently. "Sir," one of the training officers asked, "when you first used this modification in combat, were you confident it would work?" Walsh considered the question. "Confident? No. We'd done the trials, run the tests, studied the data. But there's a difference between testing in Pearl Harbor and operating in enemy waters with destroyers hunting you. Confidence came later, after the first time we stayed at snorkel depth while Japanese patrol boats passed overhead, after the first time we attacked a convoy and remained undetected, after it worked, again and again and again." "What changed?" another officer asked. "Between submarines being vulnerable and becoming dominant?" "Fundamentally, noise suppression," Walsh said. "But strategically, the willingness to take defensive technology, snorkels, and adapt it for offensive purposes. The Germans used snorkels to hide better. We used them to hunt better. That choice made all the difference." He gestured to the control room around them. "This boat, these systems, this modification, none of it looks revolutionary. There's no dramatic leap, no science fiction technology, just better engineering applied intelligently. But that's how wars change, not usually through dramatic breakthroughs, but through incremental improvements that compound into decisive advantages." The new commanding officer spoke up. "Sir, the Japanese must have known we'd modified our boats. Intelligence reports? Captured equipment? Why didn't they counter it?" Walsh smiled grimly. "They knew we'd changed something. Their hydrophone operators stopped detecting us. Their depth charges stopped connecting. Their convoy system collapsed. But knowing you have a problem and solving that problem are different things. They would have needed to redesign their hydrophones, develop new sonar frequencies, train their operators on different detection methods. That takes time, engineering time, training time, industrial time." "Time they didn't have," the officer concluded. "Exactly. By the time they could have developed effective countermeasures, the war was essentially decided. They were fighting 1944's war with 1942's tools. We were fighting 1944's war with 1945's tools. The outcome was inevitable." March 1945. Walsh's final report on snorkel operations was classified and distributed throughout the submarine force. It contained tactical recommendations, statistical analyses, lessons learned from 18 months of combat operations, but the concluding section dealt with broader strategic implications. The snorkel modification represents a paradigm shift in submarine warfare. By achieving effective acoustic invisibility, submarines have transitioned from commerce raiders to strategic siege weapons. The ability to operate undetected in enemy waters for extended periods has made traditional naval supremacy obsolete. A nation can control the surface of the ocean while losing control of everything that travels on that surface. The Japanese response, or lack thereof, demonstrates the danger of doctrinal rigidity. They continued employing ASW tactics designed for submarines they could detect. When those tactics failed, they intensified them rather than fundamentally reconsidering their approach. More destroyers, more patrol planes, more depth charges, all ineffective against targets they couldn't locate. Future conflicts will likely see further acoustic suppression technology. The advantage we currently possess is temporary. Potential adversaries will develop similar capabilities. The question becomes, what is the next technological leap? What innovation will render current capabilities obsolete? War is an iterative process. The side that innovates faster, adapts more effectively, and implements new technology more ruthlessly will prevail. The snorkel modification gave us an advantage. We exploited it decisively. But history suggests this advantage is transient. The cycle continues. April 1945. Walsh was in San Francisco when the final statistics from the Pacific submarine campaign were compiled. Total Japanese vessels sunk, 4,161 ships, 9.3 million tons. Percentage sunk by submarines, 56%. Percentage of those sunk by submarines with snorkel modifications, 73%. American submarine losses, 1944-1945, 12 boats compared to 52 losses in 1942-1943. The numbers were staggering. Submarines represented less than 2% of U.S. Navy personnel, but accounted for 56% of Japanese shipping losses. And within that already impressive category, boats equipped with snorkel modifications had achieved a kill rate nearly 4 times higher than conventional submarines while sustaining 80% fewer losses. But Walsh kept returning to a different statistic: the percentage of Japanese merchant fleet capacity remaining operational. January 1944, 100%, June 1944, 72%, December 1944, 38%, April 1945, 11%, 11%. Japan was an island nation with 11% of its pre-war shipping capacity. The mathematics of survival became impossible at that point. You couldn't move armies, couldn't fuel aircraft, couldn't feed industrial workers, couldn't sustain war production. The snorkel modification hadn't won the Pacific War by itself, but it had accelerated the endgame dramatically. Without it, the blockade of Japan would have taken years longer, cost hundreds more submarines, thousands more lives, technology as a force multiplier, engineering as strategy. May 8, 1945. Walsh listened to the radio broadcast announcing Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, fighting continued. Okinawa was still being contested. Invasion plans for Japan itself were being finalized. But Walsh knew what the planning staff knew. The invasion might not be necessary. Japan was being strangled. Oil reserves were depleted. The merchant fleet was effectively destroyed. Factory production was collapsing. The armed forces were immobilized by lack of fuel and supplies, all because submarines could operate undetected. That evening, Walsh wrote a letter to the commander from Boo Ships who'd briefed them back in March 1944. The engineer who'd explained acoustic dampening and isolated engine mounts with the enthusiasm of someone describing a technical improvement. Commander, I wanted you to know that the modification you designed worked exactly as advertised. In 18 months of combat operations, I operated at snorkel depth for approximately 2,100 hours. We were detected 0 times. We attacked 43 enemy vessels. We were counterattacked by destroyers on 11 occasions. None of those counterattacks came close to succeeding because they couldn't locate us. You described the snorkel modification as a 90% noise reduction. That technical specification translated to operational invisibility. And that invisibility translated to strategic dominance. The Japanese merchant fleet has been destroyed not through superior tactics or greater courage, but through superior engineering applied to combat operations. I don't know if you'll receive recognition for this work. Engineering improvements rarely generate headlines, but you should know that rubber-wrapped tubes and isolated engine mounts changed the course of the Pacific War. Technology as decisive as any weapon, any tactic, any strategy. Thank you for keeping me and my crew alive while we did our jobs. Respectfully, Robert Walsh, Lieutenant Commander, USN. Epilogue, August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The Pacific War ended. In the final accounting, American submarines had sunk 1,292 Japanese warships and merchant vessels between June 1944 and August 1945, the period when snorkel-equipped boats dominated operations. That represented 63% of all Japanese shipping destroyed during the war, accomplished in 27% of the war's duration. The technology that made this possible, acoustic dampening integrated into snorkel systems, remained classified until 1952. When it was finally declassified, Soviet naval engineers studied the specifications intensely. Within 3 years, their submarines featured similar modifications. The innovation cycle continued. Walsh retired from the Navy in 1947. He taught engineering at MIT, specializing in acoustic design and underwater technology. His students would go on to design the next generation of submarines, nuclear-powered, truly unlimited in underwater endurance, capable of remaining submerged for months. But Walsh always maintained that the real revolution happened in 1944. Not nuclear power, not guided missiles, not sophisticated sonar, just rubber-wrapped tubes and isolated engine mounts. Simple engineering solving a complex problem, making submarines invisible when visibility meant death. In his later years, Walsh was occasionally invited to speak about his wartime service. He always focused on the same theme. Technology changes wars, but only if you adapt your doctrine to match your capabilities. The Germans invented the snorkel, he would say, but they used it defensively. We used it offensively. That choice, that doctrinal adaptation, mattered more than the hardware itself. The Japanese never adapted. They kept using the same ASW tactics throughout 1944 and 1945. They intensified them, but never fundamentally changed them. They were fighting the war they understood instead of the war that actually existed. Innovation without adaptation is just expensive equipment. But innovation with adaptation, that changes history. Afterward. The story of snorkel-equipped submarines in 1944 illustrates how incremental technological improvements, properly exploited, can produce strategic effects out of proportion to their apparent significance. The modification wasn't revolutionary, it was evolutionary. But evolution, applied at the right moment, can be devastating. The Japanese merchant fleet never recovered. Even after the war ended, even with American assistance during reconstruction, it took nearly a decade to rebuild the shipping capacity, destroyed between 1944 and 1945. The submarines that achieved this destruction operated in plain sight. They traveled through patrolled waters, attacked defended convoys, remained in areas where they should have been detected and destroyed. But technology, simple, elegant, properly implemented technology, made them invisible. In warfare, invisibility isn't just an advantage, it's decisive. The men who operated these boats, Walsh, Morrison, Dealey, and hundreds of others, didn't know they were testing a paradigm shift. They were following orders, completing patrols, trying to survive. But their collective actions, enabled by superior engineering, strangled an empire. That's the power of innovation properly applied, silent, relentless, irresistible. Like shadows gliding beneath the waves,